everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of the History Hotline. My name is Deanna, and as always, I will be your host. This episode is the third episode in our little mini-series where we're looking at African American history or Black American history and where that intersects with Black British history and, the points where these two things kind of collide, or the people that transcend these borders of being, African American heroes to then becoming heroes maybe in Black Britain. And so today we are thinking about a man called Ira Aldridge, and I don't think many people will have heard of him. He was labelled one of the 100 Great Black Britons in a book by Patrick Vernon and Angelina Osborne that came out last year. 100 Great Black Britons is a kind of ongoing campaign where we think about Black British heroes, and 100 of them at a time are collected, and this was collated into a book. It's a wonderful book to read and kind of go through the different people that have been honoured by these two. And yeah, Ira Aldridge is one of those people in this list. It's interesting that he is in a book honouring great Black Britons, because when you find out about his actual life, you might contest this, you might agree, you might say, oh, maybe that was a mislabeling. But I definitely understand, obviously, why he's in that book here. He definitely deserves his place there. I feel like most people won't know about him because he's not really spoken about. He is, in the field of theatre and plays. And I think that's an area where we don't really think too much about the history of, unless you study maybe literature and you're looking at the context of a certain play or book. So yeah, I thought it was quite interesting to speak about Ira Aldridge today. He is, I think, one of those figures that have not been properly written into history, and I wanted to shed some light on his story. So Ira Aldridge was born in New York City, which is where I guess my questions about him being called a Black Briton come into play, although I'm not suggesting that to be a Black Briton you need to be born in Britain, not at all. Anyway, Ira Aldridge, born in New York to Reverend Daniel and Lorana Aldridge in 1807. So we're talking early 19th century, July 24th, 1807. And it wasn't until age 13 that he went to school. He went to the African Free School in New York City, which was established actually by the New York Manumission Society for the children of free Black people and slaves. So you have this school set up specifically to educate free Black people and, the children of slaves, which is great in many ways because in those days, and, you could argue now, education is going to allow for, in some ways, social mobility, better prospects in life. That's definitely the case for Ira Aldridge. This education he is given is monumental and definitely a big reason for his success that he had in his life. He was given a classical education there. They studied English grammar, writing, mathematics, geography and astronomy. Now, remember, we're talking about 1807. So the slave trade has been abolished, the transatlantic slave trade. However, slavery is still very much legal. It's alive and kicking in Britain and the British colonies and in America, and also in Spanish colonies as well around the world. So slavery is definitely still a thing. Black people are enslaved in certain places in the world and in a position where they lack the ability to be free in many places. So, Ira Aldridge, for a Black man, a Black boy, I guess, in this time, he's got quite the step up having an education. So, his early exposure to the theatre at this school included him watching plays from the high balcony of the Park Theatre in New York, which was a leading theatre at the time. He was also able to see Shakespeare's plays at the African Grove Theatre, and his acting experiences kind of began in the early 1820s with the African Company, and that was a group founded by a man called William Henry Brown and a man called James Hewlett, and they built the African Grove Theatre in 1821. And it was the first resident African-American theatre in the United States. The company was quite short-lived, but I think that alone, the fact that Ira Aldridge was part of something so monumental, was definitely probably, a reason for his later success in life. The theatre company was quite short-lived, as I said. There were protests by neighbours, there were attacks by rival companies, racist parodies, and yeah, the critics did not want to see black people in theatre. They wanted to see white people in blackface as caricatures of black people. That was how theatre worked then. And for a long time after the kind of time frame we're speaking about, minstrelsy in America is a big deal, in Britain too. And, racist tropes and stereotypes are portrayed through the blacking up of white men who would get on stage and act in a stereotypical, cartoonish, animalistic-like fashion, portraying black people. So the fact that black people were now on stage, not mocking themselves, but simply playing roles that were written for a whole host of people, was a problem for most people. And this problem really does hit Ira in many parts of his career, especially in England, which we will get to shortly. So Ira Aldridge, he made his acting debut in the United States. He played Rolla, a Peruvian character, in Richard Brinsley Sheridan's Pizarro. Now, just like many black people at the time, he felt the persistent discrimination, the racism, the prejudice, but especially so as a black actor in the United States at a time where, slavery is still very much happening. And I think the idea that maybe for white people in America, they could see black people in a position of inferiority in their eyes, and in a position of submission to white people and whiteness. I think that gave them wings to hold all black people to a certain standard of inferiority, which we know, which isn't really a shock thing about that time. It's not really something that's arguably changed much, but I think, Ira Aldridge knew that he was great. That's what I will say. I really do. I think this man must have had bags of confidence and self-belief and ambition, because he said, I'm not going to stay here and endure this in the United States. And I don't know many people in history that do that. I know they would rather maybe change career, change path, or take another route to get to the end goal. Or, their life then becomes a mission to fight racism and fight racial prejudice. But in Ira Aldridge's case, he says no. He gets on a ship and heads to Liverpool, England in 1824 with another actor called James Wallack. And off he goes. He says Britain might be better. He will have more of a shot there. And that's what he decides to do, because remember, Britain have just gotten rid of the slave trade. And they are moving towards, conversations are happening about abolishing slavery. I mean, it doesn't get abolished until 1833, and we're talking about 1824 at the moment. So, the idea that black people might have more freedom in Britain was clearly on Ira Aldridge's mind, and with that he decided to leave. So, age 17, Ira Aldridge finds himself in London, and, to be an actor and to get roles, nothing has really changed. You kind of need to have some recognition. You need to have a name behind you. People need to know who you are. They want to be able to book you because they know you'll sell out the theatre. People buy tickets because they want to see you. That's the same now, whether it's movies or the theatre, and that was the same then. So Ira Aldridge, as I've said, this man, he's full of ambition, and I think he definitely knew how good he must have been, because he decides that in order to be successful and to book shows, he has to create a story. So he creates a story of his African lineage, claiming to be a descendant of the Fulani princely line. And just for some context, the Fulani people were an ethnic group, and they were spread over quite a few countries, but predominantly in West Africa. But they're also found in Central Africa and Sudan and East Africa. But mainly present in West Africa, and the name is Fulani in most records, but I think they also go by Fula or Fulbi, and they all kind of derive from different languages, but meaning the same thing essentially. And so Ira Aldridge claims to be one of these people and of the princely line of the Fulani people, which is very, very interesting, and what that did for his career. So, age 17, May 1825, Ira Aldridge first appears on a London stage, amazing, in a low-profile production of Othello. And then in the spring of 1825, he is in The Revolt of Suriname, or also known as A Slave's Revenge, at the Royal Coburg Theatre, which is actually the site of the Old Vic in London now. And that was kind of his big high-profile debut. And then he becomes the first African-American actor to establish himself professionally in a foreign country, which is where the accolades and the kind of titles start rolling in. Now, 1825, that is a very long time ago. Obviously, you know that. But when we think about, some of the great Black Britons, we often think about people in the Windrush era. And I'm really happy that we were able to take it back to the early 19th century to look at Ira Aldridge and his story. Because as we know, and as I've said, Black people did not play Black people on stage in those times. And even later on, white people played Black people in blackface. And so the fact that Ira Aldridge is now playing, Othello, this is a big Shakespearean play. Shakespeare is writing in the 15 and 1600s, so this is 200 years plus, Shakespeare is still probably as loved as he is now and was then. And, Ira Aldridge, as a Black man, is playing Othello. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's also claimed that he is of a princely Fulani line, so maybe that was part of it, and maybe he knew that was the leverage he needed to get himself casted in these roles. Okay, so he got the roles, he got himself on stage, but the response. Now, what do you think the response is going to be when I say, he's a Black man playing Black roles, and even playing roles that weren't necessarily for a Black man? The results were hostile, of course. From the critics were not happy. They reacted with hostility. They didn't like it. They didn't want to see it anymore. And he was slated, essentially. However, this is where I'm talking about Ira Aldridge's confidence in his own abilities and his own ability to wow a crowd, because audiences loved him. And this is what kept his career going. Now, any aspiring actors that are listening, the audience gotta love you. I don't know if that's the same now. I have no acting training at all in my life. But the fact that the audience wanted him, and the fact that the audience were obviously buying tickets and, funding these productions by way of ticket sales, he was called back to stage, and he was able to develop a repertoire of, roles in Othello, which is obviously big Shakespearean roles, in abolitionist melodramas, comedies, musical farces. And it was noted that Aldridge could actually perform as many as 16 different roles on demand. This is from the book 100 Black Britons, by the way, the chapter on Ira Aldridge. 16 different roles. You might be thinking, oh, well, yeah, sure, he's an actor, it's his job. But apparently, back then, actors would normally play 3 roles in an evening. He was doing 16. And all I'm hearing now is, as a Black person, you have to work 10 times as hard or twice as hard to get half as much. 16 times by 3 is a lot more than twice as hard. So you can see he's clearly putting in the work, and he's clearly very much a skilled actor. I think by the end of his career, he had a repertoire of around 40 characters in his head. That shows not only his talent, but his hard work, his dedication to his craft. He was not going to let anyone, outperform him, essentially, or pick up a role that he couldn't do, because he had mastered so many. And if you think he's going from musical farces to Shakespearean comedies, tragedies, and histories, melodramas and comedies as well, that weren't Shakespearean, his repertoire and his range was just phenomenal when you think about it. So Ira Aldridge, by about 1833, he's still kind of struggling to get roles, but the audience is kind of also carrying him through. So he returns to London to play Othello, actually, at the Covent Garden Theatre. He only performs for 2 nights. Critics are absolutely savage, laying into him. They don't like it. And it's noted that they didn't like his manner, his voice, his accent, and they didn't like his colour. None of the things I'm surprised by. His accent actually is quite interesting. I would assume it would be somewhat American twinged. But then also Americans then didn't have the American accent that we now know, because 1825, there's still quite a few generations of... They're only a few generations into free America, and they're still the descendants of British people, so the accents are still somewhat British. And then also, probably twinged with the Shakespearean dialects and all that other stuff. So I would be quite interested to know what his accent would have been like. I don't know if there would be anyone that would have this information. I don't know how a historian would maybe pick this up, because obviously there were no recordings, and I don't know if anybody ever commented on his accent, although the critics definitely didn't like it. But yeah, he won praise from audiences again. And so he performed for around 19 years more in the provinces, and he kind of does a lot of work on Shakespearean dramas. So he plays Shylock, Richard III, and Macbeth. And if any of you are thinking, yeah, these are roles for white men, these are definitely roles for white men. Shylock the Jew in the Merchant of Venice, Richard III obviously in Richard III, one of the histories, and Macbeth in Macbeth. He's not playing Othello anymore. He is playing roles that are for a white man, and I'm sure that was ruffling many, many more feathers, because now he's not only just doing the roles that white men were doing in blackface, he's now doing roles in whiteface. You might be thinking, what is whiteface? And I don't know if whiteface is the right word. There's some words you just can't flip. But essentially he would have used grease paint to whiten his face to play these roles, because colourblind casting wasn't a thing then. So yeah, he would have, essentially been really made up to look white to take on these roles. And again, it was not accepted. It was fine if white men were blacking up their faces to play black characters and to mock them and to do minstrelsy, but it was not okay for a black man to be playing white characters. I guess that can clearly highlight the double standard we are dealing with here in Britain. In 1852, Ira Aldridge embarked on a tour of Europe, and he returns to England actually after about 3 years. But I think this is another example of Aldridge knowing his worth and knowing where he's appreciated and going there to make his money. So in Europe, he is, booked and busy. He's going from Russia to France to Poland, and he's performing tragedies. He's performing Shakespeare's work. He is, he's getting the roles. And I think it's very important to note that, whilst he wasn't succeeding in the way that he wanted to in London, he was in other countries in Europe. And I guess maybe that could lead us to understand maybe different race relations and racial tensions that were happening on the continent. We don't often think about, well, not on this podcast anyway, racism in other European countries. And I wouldn't want to make comparisons because I don't think that's helpful. But there's clearly differences, because he is doing very well when he is away and not in London. He comes back with honours and awards, but, he still can't find like a regular gig in London acting. And yeah, I think that kind of highlights, the racial situation, shall we say, in the UK when it came to black men playing themselves and others on stage and being visible. When you think about it, this is like 19th century Britain, and we don't really see or know of necessarily in the mainstream of history black people that were prominent, because they are kind of erased. And being on stage, being an actor, being a person that conveys a story that's, been written by a playwright or whoever, you are visible. You're visible in the newspaper because the critics are writing about you. You're visible on playbills. You're visible in spaces of entertainment, and that clearly was not okay for British people at the time. And I think that's what that speaks on, more so than necessarily thinking about overt or covert racism or institutional racism, which isn't so much of a thing then, because their institutions are definitely not going to serve black people because they're so few in number. And also, 1852, we're talking about, whilst slavery in the colonies has ended, black people are still not in a position where they have equal rights in any way, shape or form. And how quickly can people change a mindset of one day, black people are to be enslaved and to be used for labour, and the next day they're not. And we know that slavery didn't just end and everybody was set free. There was a long 6-year period of apprenticeship, and then black people continued to work the land in the colonies anyway, and to work in the same roles of agriculture because that's all they knew, that's all they had kind of grown up to do and be able to do. Anyway, we're kind of branching off there, definitely on a tangent. So let's get back to Ira Aldridge and his life. I think fortunately for him, he spent his final years performing in France and Russia and Poland. He was acclaimed as one of the greatest tragedians of all time. He unfortunately died while on tour in Poland in August 1867. And, earlier than I think maybe he was expected to, it does kind of read that he died quite suddenly. He was married twice. He had 2 children that survived, I think, into adulthood, both of them, I think, became singers or classically trained. And one of them was actually the vocal coach for Paul Robeson, who was a big singer, actor and political activist in the 20th century. So Miss, I think, Amanda Aldridge, she was his vocal coach, which is quite interesting that legacy kind of continued into a man as great as Paul Robeson, who I'm sure many of you will know. Or if not, if you go and have a research, you'll definitely know some of his tunes, I'm sure of it. So, Ira Aldridge, the first major black Shakespearean actor in Europe, and one of the most talented actors of his day, I would say. Now, his career obviously spanned, his life. Until he passed away, he was acting. And I would like to note, though, he never actually performed again in America. I think it was clear that he knew where he was wanted, appreciated, and could find work, and America was not that place. And I think that's why I kind of wanted to speak about him today, just to think about not necessarily the racism in America, but just to think about how great this man was in his ability to find a moment and a space for himself in the theatre, in the acting scene. I think that is that's a very important skill to have in life generally, let alone, navigating 19th century Britain, America and Europe. It's so funny, I never think of Britain as part of Europe. I know it is, no Brexit talks are going to happen here. I know we're not part of the European Union, but Britain culturally is just so far removed from Europe for me. Always kind of separate them as separate entities, but yeah, they're all one. We know this. So he never worked again in America. He stopped kind of working in Britain, and the European stage, by European I mean French, Polish, and the Russian stage were where, he got his accolades and where he was appreciated, and that's where he stayed. And I think for me, having done a little bit of research in the past into minstrelsy and I would say the art of that, it was apparently an art, it's just so crude and vile. I hate it. So thinking about minstrelsy and the way that white people would see as entertainment to mock these caricatures of black people who were being not portrayed as a black person. Obviously, there are stereotypes surrounded with being black that aren't necessarily damaging. Some of them can just be funny. These were not anything funny. These were damaging. These are hurtful. These were animalistic representations of black people. And the fact that the expectation was that this man, Ira Aldridge, when he came on stage, was to be like that, was to be like the caricatures they had seen, because their proximity to black people at that time was not very, it wasn't very much, they didn't see black people necessarily all the time. And so when they saw Ira Aldridge and expected him to come on clumsily and to be bumbling around stage, acting the fool, and he didn't, he was a Shakespearean actor. He was clearly talented. He could have 40 characters in his head at any one time. I think that highlights his, first of all, talent, as I've said so many times, but also his diligence, his dignity, his integrity to playing these roles and not being typecasted into something that he was not and he did not wish to portray on stage at all. And so, yes, that is why Ira Aldridge is the third kind of episode in this series where we're looking at the histories of Black Americans and Black Britons and the intersections and all that, and Black liberation movements and everything in between. But I just thought it was integral that I shared his story, and I didn't really know where else it could go. But it also kind of leads into next week's episode where we will be talking about literature and some great African American and Black British texts that I think have influenced culture, abolition movements, liberation movements later on, nationalism, and a lot of kind of key things. So yeah, please stay tuned for the next episode. If you're listening when this episode just came out, you'll have to wait a week. But obviously, if you're listening later, the fourth episode in this series will be available. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, follow, subscribe, share, tell a friend about the History Hotline, because we just want to educate more people about Black British history and Black history beyond Britain. So thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day. Bye.